Most men think violence only happens when voices rise, things break, or someone walks out the door. But there's another kind of violence, quiet, invisible, and harder to prove, that happens inside relationships every day. It's psychological. It leaves no bruises, but it leaves a man doubting his worth, second-guessing his memories, and walking on eggshells in his own home. Women who use psychological violence don't need to shout to control you. They use silence, guilt, emotional withdrawal, subtle criticism, and manipulation to weaken your confidence until you stop being the man you once were. You start apologizing for things you didn't do. You start craving her approval instead of commanding respect. The shocking truth is that this form of control is often seen as normal behavior because it's quiet and disguised as emotion or care. But it slowly eats away at a man's strength, his peace, and his direction. The modern dating world has made it even more dangerous because emotional tactics now come wrapped in charm, vulnerability, and sensitivity. What begins as affection can quickly turn into control, not through power, but through guilt and confusion. A man who doesn't understand this dynamic will think he's being kind by tolerating it, but the longer he allows it, the deeper the damage runs. This video will expose the ways women use psychological violence and show you how to see through it, stay grounded, and regain emotional authority. Once you recognize it, you'll never see certain behaviors the same again. This isn't about hating women. It's about waking up to the hidden power games that keep good men feeling small and silent. What you learn here can save your self-respect, your peace, and maybe even your future relationships. 1. The power of subtle control. Psychological violence doesn't start with shouting or insults. It begins quietly. A woman who uses it learns how to influence your emotions without appearing aggressive. She makes small comments that chip away at your confidence, questioning your choices, doubting your capabilities, comparing you to others, all while sounding like she's only trying to help. At first you brush it off, thinking she's just being honest or emotional. But over time, you start adjusting your behavior to avoid triggering her reactions. You start making choices to keep the peace instead of staying true to yourself. That's when subtle control has taken root. She learns that her moods control your actions, and once she knows that, she doesn't need to shout or threaten. All she has to do is pull back affection, go cold, or show disappointment, and you'll bend. This kind of control works because it plays on a man's natural desire to protect, to fix, to be accepted. The more you care, the easier it becomes for her to steer your behavior. You start living in a quiet emotional prison where your self-worth depends on her approval. This is why so many men lose themselves in relationships without realizing it. They think they're keeping love alive, but what they're really doing is surrendering their identity piece by piece. Recognizing subtle control means learning to see beyond words and focus on patterns. When you notice that your peace depends on her mood or your decisions depend on her reactions, you're no longer in control. The only way to break free is by detaching emotionally and standing firm in your boundaries. Control loses power the moment you stop seeking permission to be yourself. 2. Guilt as a weapon. When direct control doesn't work, guilt becomes the next tool. Women who use psychological violence understand how powerful guilt is in shaping a man's behavior. They don't need to argue or demand. They just need to make you feel like you've disappointed them. It's quiet, but it's heavy. You'll hear things like, "I just thought you cared more," or "I guess I was wrong about you." And those words hit harder than any insult because they target your conscience. A man who truly cares will go out of his way to make things right, even when he's done nothing wrong. That's where the manipulation works best. The goal isn't to solve a problem. It's to train you to associate your peace with her happiness. Once she sees that you respond to guilt, it becomes her unspoken weapon of choice. You'll start apologizing to stop her silence, overcompensating to restore balance, and doubting your own intentions even when you've been respectful. The longer it continues, the more you shrink. Guilt creates invisible chains. You move carefully, speak carefully, and live carefully just to avoid upsetting her. But no matter how much you give, It's never enough because guilt isn't meant to end. It's meant to control. You can only break this pattern by realizing that your worth isn't defined by her emotional reactions. Feeling guilty for something you didn't do isn't love. It's manipulation dressed as vulnerability. The moment you stop explaining yourself to prove you care, the power of guilt begins to fade. A woman who uses guilt will either adjust her behavior or reveal her true nature. Either way, you win by standing firm. Guilt only works on the man who needs approval more than he needs peace. 3. Silence and emotional withholding. One of the most dangerous forms of psychological violence is silence. Not the peaceful kind that comes from calm reflection, but the calculated silence used to punish, confuse, and control. A woman who uses silence as a weapon knows that men crave clarity. She understands that uncertainty eats at your mind, so she removes communication to make you chase her emotionally. She doesn't argue, she retreats. She won't tell you what's wrong, yet she makes sure you feel her absence. Every text left unanswered, every cold stare, every dismissive sigh. It's all designed to make you question yourself. You begin wondering what you did wrong, and soon you start begging for connection just to feel normal again. That's the trap. The silence makes you work for the peace she's withholding. Once you start chasing her emotions, she controls the rhythm of the relationship. You become reactive. She becomes dominant. The more you try to fix the silence, the more you reinforce her power. This is how psychological violence works. It feeds off your need for emotional closure. But you can neutralize this by doing the opposite of what she expects. Don't chase. Don't demand answers. Stay calm, composed, and detached. When you stop reacting to her silence, you take away its power. That's when she's forced to confront herself. True emotional strength is built in those moments when you refuse to be manipulated by the absence of attention. A man who maintains peace in the middle of silence becomes untouchable because his stability no longer depends on anyone's approval or reaction, and that's when she realizes she can't control what she can't shake. 4. Rewriting reality. This is one of the most damaging tactics women use in psychological warfare. Rewriting reality. It happens slowly through denial, distortion, and selective memory. She'll say things didn't happen the way you remember, insist you're overreacting, or claim you misunderstood her words. Over time, this constant rewriting chips away at your confidence in your own perception. You begin to doubt your memory, your feelings, and even your sanity. That's how gaslighting works, not by erasing facts, but by replacing them with confusion. You'll notice that every time you try to discuss a problem, she flips the story, and somehow you end up defending yourself. You start wondering if you're the problem, if maybe you're too sensitive or too demanding. That self-doubt is her victory. When a man no longer trusts his own reality, he becomes easy to control. The relationship turns into a maze where every turn leads back to her being the victim and you being the cause. That's how psychological violence thrives, through emotional inversion. The only way to counter it is with awareness and calm certainty. You must hold on to what you saw, what you heard, and what you felt without needing her to confirm it. Keep mental notes, stay composed, and refuse to argue over obvious truth. When you stop fighting for her version of events, you take away her ability to distort yours. She may accuse, deflect, or twist your words, but when you remain grounded in what you know, the manipulation loses its grip. The key is not to convince her. It's to stay clear within yourself. Rewriting reality only works on a man who needs agreement more than he needs truth. Once you choose truth, you reclaim control of your mind and your peace. 5. Emotional overload. Emotional overload happens when a woman floods you with intense emotion to shut down your logic and gain control of the situation. It's one of the most subtle and effective forms of psychological violence because it feels real. She'll cry, shout, or spiral into emotional chaos whenever you try to express a boundary or call out bad behavior. You find yourself stepping back, softening your tone, and trying to comfort her instead of standing firm. That's the moment control shifts. You stop leading the conversation and start managing her emotions. The tactic works because it forces you into protector mode, but it's never about resolution. It's about distraction. Every time the focus moves to her emotional reaction, the real issue disappears. And when this pattern repeats, you begin to fear her emotions. You avoid bringing up problems, you stay silent to prevent an outburst, and you carry emotional weight that isn't yours. That's how she keeps you contained, through exhaustion. But the truth is, no man can lead from a place of emotional submission. To counter emotional overload, you have to detach without being cold. Recognize that her reaction isn't your responsibility. You can acknowledge her feelings without absorbing them. Stay calm, speak slowly, and never raise your emotional temperature to match hers. The calmer you stay, the quicker her emotional storm passes because it has nothing to feed on. Eventually, she realizes that emotional chaos no longer controls you. That's when her tactics lose power. Emotional overload only dominates men who mistake peacekeeping for strength. Real strength is staying centered even when someone tries to pull you into their storm. The man who masters emotional control becomes impossible to manipulate because his peace can't be taken, only given. 6. The victim mask. The victim mask is one of the most deceptive tools of psychological violence because it hides control behind vulnerability. A woman using this tactic makes herself look like the one who's hurt, misunderstood, or mistreated, even when she's the one creating the chaos. She shifts blame by playing weak, and because most men are naturally protective, you'll feel guilty for her pain even when you didn't cause it. Every time you stand your ground, she turns it into an emotional wound. Every boundary you set becomes you being cruel. Soon you find yourself apologizing for doing what was necessary to protect your peace. That's how the victim mask works. It makes you responsible for her emotions while she avoids accountability for her behavior. Over time, you begin walking on emotional glass, afraid of saying or doing anything that might hurt her. That fear keeps you compliant. It's not that you're weak, it's that you're compassionate, but compassion without awareness turns into control. When a woman uses the victim mask, her goal is to win the emotional narrative, not the truth. She wants to be seen as the one who's always wronged, so you'll keep trying to fix things that aren't broken. The only way to break free is by refusing to participate in false guilt. You can empathize with her feelings, but don't surrender to them. Calmly state your truth, hold your line, and let her emotions settle without chasing her approval. The moment you stop rescuing her from her self-created pain, the manipulation loses its fuel. Women respect men who don't crumble when they cry, who stay compassionate but firm. The victim mask fails against a man who sees it for what it is, a shield for control, not a cry for help. 7. Isolation and dependency. Isolation and dependency are the final stages of psychological violence, when subtle control turns into emotional captivity. This happens when she slowly disconnects you from the world around you under the disguise of love, care, or wanting more time together. It begins with small suggestions. She doesn't like your friends, says your family doesn't respect her, or claims that your hobbies take you away from her. At first, it feels like she just wants closeness, but over time, your circle shrinks until she's your only consistent emotional connection. That's when dependency takes over. You start turning to her for approval, comfort, and validation because you've lost other sources of emotional grounding. It becomes her world and your silence. She has created an environment where you're emotionally dependent and isolated from outside influence, and that's when control becomes absolute. This is the deepest form of psychological violence because it traps you mentally. You stop noticing the cage because it's built with affection. You stop resisting because it feels like love. To break this pattern, you must rebuild your independence piece by piece. Reconnect with your friends, your passions, and your sense of purpose. When you have a life outside her emotional field, her power weakens instantly. A woman can only dominate what she can isolate. The moment you create distance between her moods and your happiness, you regain control. The goal isn't to shut her out, but to stand on your own again. Once you're no longer dependent on her reactions, she can no longer define your value. Emotional isolation is the weapon of control. Independence is the shield that ends it. The man who rebuilds his world reclaims his peace and becomes impossible to break again. Psychological violence is quiet but destructive. It's the manipulation that hides in affection, the control that wears the mask of love. Once you recognize the signs, guilt, silence, emotional overload, rewriting reality, the victim act, and isolation, you stop being controlled by them. Awareness gives you back power, and power gives you back peace. Never trade your identity for comfort or your voice for connection. Stay calm, stay grounded, and choose truth over approval. The moment you stop feeding manipulation with reaction, you take your strength back, and no one can use your emotions against you again.